When a little boy begged his school's janitor to let him stay at the school overnight, the janitor initially thought that the boy was just a young child looking for an adventure. However, after he noticed the boy's jumpy and scared demeanor, and saw a bruise peeking out from under the boy's sleeve, he realized that something sinister and evil was going on in the little boy's home. With the boy's safety hanging in the balance, a race against time began as the boy's teacher, the janitor, and a determined social worker rushed to save him before it was too late. This was a story of bravery, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The weather outside Cedarbrook Academy that autumn afternoon was mild, with a few golden leaves drifting across the schoolyard as dusk approached. The hallways echoed with final footsteps as the remaining students headed home for the evening. It was the kind of serene moment when the day's bustle quieted into a gentle hush, leaving behind the faint scent of cleaning fluid and the distant hum of overhead lights. Mr. Whitaker, the school's janitor, was finishing his day's routine, mopping floors, checking on the trash, and ensuring the front doors were locked. He was an older man with a slight limp in his gait, though he seldom spoke of how it came to be. He was meticulous in his work, always taking pride in keeping the building tidy for the children. He believed a clean school helped nurture young minds, and it was a point of pride for him that staff members often remarked on the school's welcoming environment. As he shuffled along the corridor leading to the cafeteria, he heard a soft, rustling noise behind him. The corridor lights were dimmed for the evening, making it harder to see past the rows of lockers, so he paused for a moment, his mop handle resting against his torso. Then he heard it again, a slight shuffling of feet or perhaps a gentle brushing of fabric against metal. It was not unusual for a child to linger behind after extracurricular activities, but it was rather late. He rounded a corner near the cafeteria to investigate. There, standing near a bench tucked against the wall, he found Noah. Noah was small for his 11 years, with large brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He wore a hoodie with the school's emblem embroidered in a corner, and he clutched his backpack close to his chest. He looked startled at being discovered, and a momentary tension flickered across his eyes. Mr. Whitaker had seen him many times before, always quiet, always polite in the halls, rarely making a fuss. Yet there was a difference in his posture that day, a guardedness beyond his usual shyness. Mr. Whitaker offered a gentle smile and set his mop aside. "Hey there, kid," he said. "School's closing up soon. You doin' all right?" Noah took a moment before he spoke in a barely audible voice. Could I stay here tonight, please?" Mr. Whitaker almost thought the boy was joking or perhaps imagining some childhood adventure, a grand sleepover in the gym or some ghost-hunting escapade in the classrooms. But the fear in Noah's voice and the tremble in his small hands were impossible to ignore. Mr. Whitaker's heart clenched with concern. The boy's voice wasn't filled with excitement. It was laced with an edge of desperation. "Stay overnight?" Mr. Whitaker asked gently. "Why on earth would you want to do that?" Noah swallowed hard. He opened his mouth as though to offer an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. Mr. Whitaker noticed the way the boy's gaze flicked back and forth, as though expecting something or someone to appear out of the shadows. It was then that Mr. Whitaker also noticed the faint bruise peeking from beneath Noah's sleeve. The boy seemed to sense that Mr. Whitaker's eyes were on his arm, for he quickly pulled his sleeve down, turning his body slightly away as though wanting to hide it. "Just for tonight," Noah whispered, his tone pleading. "I promise I won't cause any trouble." Mr. Whitaker looked at Noah carefully, wondering if there had been a fight with another student or if something at home was so awful that sleeping at school felt like a safer option. The old janitor's chest tightened. He had lived through enough in his own life to recognize fear in a child, and this was not the kind of fear that came from some childish worry about monsters under the bed. He spoke softly. "Noah, are you scared to go home?" For a long moment, Noah did not respond. Then, with a tiny nod, tears pooling in the corners of his eyes, he said, "Yes." Those 3 letters carried so much weight that Mr. Whitaker's own breathing grew heavy. He could sense that the situation was serious. As kind as the staff at Cedarbrook Academy were, there were protocols that had to be followed. One did not simply leave a child overnight in a public school. But more than that, there was an uneasy coil in Mr. Whitaker's stomach that told him the boy's request was born of something dire. He reached out and put a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder. The boy flinched, but after that initial jolt, he let Mr. Whitaker's hand remain. "All right," Mr. Whitaker said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I can't let you stay here without telling someone. Let's go see if your teacher is still around. Is that okay?" Noah's eyes filled with a flash of panic, but he nodded once more, lips quivering. Mr. Whitaker guided him down the corridor toward the administrative wing, where he hoped he might still find Mr. Carver, or at least Ms. Delaney. Both of them often stayed late to grade papers or set up lesson plans for the next day. Mr. Whitaker found himself moving at a deliberate pace, trying to keep Noah's anxiety from erupting. With each step, he became more certain something was wrong, deeply wrong. As they reached Mr. Carver's classroom, the light was still on. Through the narrow window on the door, Mr. Whitaker could see the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Mr. Carver gathering papers into neat piles on his desk. He knocked softly on the door. Mr. Carver looked up, and his expression shifted from mild surprise to concern when he recognized Mr. Whitaker and saw the boy standing beside him. "Come in," Mr. Carver said, setting down his stack of tests. He noticed the fear in Noah's stance immediately. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Whitaker held a hand out to encourage Noah to step inside. The boy hesitated, then walked into the classroom, keeping his eyes downcast. Mr. Carver glanced toward Mr. Whitaker questioningly. The janitor, choosing his words carefully, said, "Noah here. He's asked if he can spend the night at the school. Says he's afraid to go home." Mr. Carver's mouth formed a grim line. He had a compassionate heart and a keen intuition honed by years of observing children in vulnerable situations. He moved around his desk and crouched down to Noah's height, speaking gently. "Noah, can you tell me why you don't want to go home?" Noah drew in a shaky breath and tried to speak. At first, nothing came out. He looked away, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "It's just not safe," he finally whispered, repeating the words as though reciting a hidden mantra. "It's not safe there." Mr. Carver pressed his lips together, feeling a wave of protective anger stir within him. "Okay, buddy," he said softly. "We'll figure this out. I promise." The boy nodded but said no more. Mr. Whitaker lifted his gaze to meet Mr. Carver's eyes, and what passed between them was a deep recognition that they would have to do something quickly. They exchanged a few quiet words about contacting the principal and the authorities. Even if it was nearing 6 in the evening, they couldn't simply send Noah home with this kind of unspoken terror clinging to him. While Mr. Carver retrieved his phone to call the principal, Ms. Delaney appeared in the doorway, stepping in quietly. She had apparently seen them from the corridor and, noticing the tense atmosphere, slipped into the classroom. She had a look of worry etched across her face. "I heard voices. Is something going on?" she asked. Mr. Whitaker explained the basics. That Noah did not feel safe going home, and it seemed more and more probable that he was in danger there. Ms. Delaney's features softened. She walked over and knelt beside him, addressing him in a warm, gentle voice. "Noah, you know we're here for you, right? There are people who care about you. You're not alone." Noah's eyes flicked between Mr. Carver and Ms. Delaney, then to Mr. Whitaker. For a brief moment it looked as though he might reveal everything, might spill out his entire story in a rush of tears and confessions. But instead, all he did was nod again, the tension in his face never easing. Mr. Carver concluded his phone call and looked at them with an exhale. "Principal Harris told me to contact social services," he said. "We can keep him here a bit longer, but we definitely need to let them know. They may need to come talk to Noah." He spoke the words as gently as possible, but the mention of social services made Noah's eyes widen in terror. He shook his head, stepping back from Mr. Carver. "No," he said, voice trembling. "Please. I don't want to get taken away." Ms. Delaney tried to soothe him. "Noah, social services is there to help children who aren't safe. They're not the bad guys. They can figure out how to protect you." "But I'll get moved again," he whispered. "I'll get moved somewhere else, and I'll never come back to this school." His mouth clamped shut. He seemed to realize that in voicing his fear of being moved again, he had revealed something about his life, something that suggested he was not living with his biological family and that there was a history of instability. The staff exchanged understanding glances. There was, indeed, a troubled story beneath all this, and it was more complicated than they had guessed. Mr. Carver brushed his hand gently on Noah's shoulder. "We just want you safe," he said. "We'll do whatever we can to make sure you don't get hurt." Tears slid down Noah's cheeks, but he made no sound. Ms. Delaney stroked the back of his head, trying to console him. Mr. Whitaker, trying to lighten the situation even a little, said, "Come on, let's sit for a bit. I can grab something from the vending machine. You hungry? I'll bet you haven't had dinner yet." Noah hesitated, then nodded slowly. Ms. Delaney pulled out a chair at Mr. Carver's desk, and the boy sat. Mr. Whitaker left the room momentarily, and the silence that followed felt heavy. Ms. Delaney glanced at Mr. Carver, who rubbed his temples as he considered the phone in his hand. He knew they had to do something, and quickly, but Noah's anxiety about going to social services was palpable. When Mr. Whitaker returned with a bottle of water and a small bag of chips, he placed them in front of Noah. "Not the healthiest dinner, but it'll do until we can arrange something else," he said, attempting to sound cheerful. Mr. Carver, determined, dialed the local Child Protective Services hotline. He asked to speak with Ms. Rowan, a social worker known to the school for her empathy and diligent approach. By this time, the sky outside had grown dark, the once empty corridors now illuminated only by security lights. Night had fallen over Cedarbrook Academy, and the hush in the building felt almost tangible. While Mr. Carver spoke quietly on the phone, Ms. Delaney and Mr. Whitaker did their best to keep Noah calm, asking him gentle questions about his interests in class, about which subjects he liked most. Noah fidgeted but managed to speak a bit about how he enjoyed reading and that he preferred quiet activities to large group sports. In these small confessions, they recognized a glimmer of a boy who might have had a chance at a normal life if not for the overshadowing darkness in his personal circumstances. After a short while, Mr. Carver ended the call. "Ms. Rowan is on her way," he said. "She told us to stay with him until she arrives." Noah's head sank lower, but he didn't protest. He seemed to sense that there was no turning back. Mr. Whitaker gently patted him on the back. "We're here," he murmured. "Don't worry." The wait for Ms. Rowan took a little over an hour, though it felt longer. During that time, Ms. Delaney and Mr. Carver discussed small, soothing topics with Noah, while Mr. Whitaker occasionally peered out into the hallway, listening for the social worker's approach. Eventually, there was the sound of heels clicking purposefully against the floor, and Ms. Rowan stepped into the classroom. She was a slender woman with a purposeful air, carrying a leather-bound folder and wearing a sympathetic but focused expression. She offered a warm smile to Noah as she approached. "Noah," she said in a gentle voice, "my name's Ms. Rowan. I'm here to help you, okay?" Noah looked as though he wanted to say something, but he simply nodded, eyes down on the floor. Ms. Rowan crouched beside him, her posture open and reassuring. She glanced at Mr. Carver and Ms. Delaney. "Could I have a moment alone with him?" she asked, in a voice so kind that it was difficult to refuse. The teachers exchanged looks, uncertain if he was comfortable being left alone, but Ms. Rowan gave them a small nod that suggested she had handled many such cases before. In a quiet voice, Mr. Carver said to Noah, "We'll be right outside if you need us, okay?" Noah nodded again, and they filed into the hallway, leaving the social worker alone with him. The wooden door closed behind them with a soft thud, and they were left staring through the narrow window pane. Ms. Rowan began to speak softly to Noah, though they couldn't hear her words. His face was turned away from the door, giving him some measure of privacy. Minutes passed slowly. Every so often, Ms. Rowan asked a question, and the slight bob of Noah's head indicated that he was responding, though not with much vigor. At one point, Ms. Rowan gently touched his arm, which caused him to flinch, and Mr. Carver felt a pang of sadness at how visibly skittish the boy was. Ms. Delaney, standing beside Mr. Carver, murmured, "I hope he tells her something. Anything." Her eyes glistened with tears, though she tried to keep her emotions contained. Mr. Whitaker, arms crossed, stared at the distant walls, feeling the same storm of worry. He had never fathered children of his own, but he cared for all the kids at Cedarbrook in his quiet way. The fact that an 11-year-old boy needed to beg to stay at school because home was too frightening weighed on his heart like a stone. He felt angry, sad, and determined all at once. Eventually, Ms. Rowan guided Noah to his feet and opened the classroom door, offering a thin smile. "Why don't we all sit together now?" she suggested. "Noah, are you comfortable if we do that?" He gave a small nod, so the teachers and Mr. Whitaker returned to the room, forming a small circle around him. Ms. Rowan perched on the edge of a table, addressing them with a practiced calm. "Noah has said he doesn't want to go home," she explained gently. "At this point, we need to assess the situation more thoroughly. But I've told him that I'd like to speak with the family he's living with. Their names are Colin and Marissa Gaines, correct?" She looked at Noah for confirmation. The boy nodded, his lower lip trembling slightly at the mention of their names. Ms. Rowan turned to Mr. Carver. "Would you mind if I asked you and the other staff here about any signs of possible abuse or neglect that you've noticed? It's important that we gather any indication of something amiss." Her tone was clear that she took this matter very seriously. Mr. Carver exchanged glances with Ms. Delaney. "We've noticed that he's been withdrawn, reluctant to speak in class, but that could be a variety of things," Ms. Delaney offered. "Then there's the bruise on his arm, and I think I saw some older ones before, but he always wore long sleeve. He said it was from sports, or from falling down, or from messing around with some neighborhood kids. We didn't push him too hard for an explanation, but we've been concerned." Mr. Whitaker added quietly, "I've noticed he's become more jumpy over the past few weeks. I thought maybe he was just anxious about classes, but now I'm not so sure. It's like he's always on edge." Ms. Rowan kept her composure, nodding as she took note. "All right," she said gently. "Thank you. I'll be speaking with the Gaineses tonight if possible, and see what they have to say. But until I can make an immediate assessment, we should figure out what we can do about Noah. Normally, I would consider calling the police if we suspected imminent danger, but we don't have enough to go on yet for an emergency removal." She glanced down at Noah. "Noah, I want to talk to your foster parents, okay? And I'll do it in a way that keeps you safe. You're not in trouble. I just need to see if we can arrange for you to stay somewhere else tonight, maybe in a safe place that we can supervise, if your foster parents won't cooperate." Noah's eyes filled with tears. He held his breath for a moment, then said in a small voice, "Okay." It sounded like he was trying to accept an inevitability he had dreaded. Mr. Carver leaned forward. "He can stay with me if that's allowed," he offered. "At least for tonight, so he doesn't have to go back if he's afraid." Ms. Rowan regarded him with appreciation. "I understand your concern, Mr. Carver, but let me see what the protocol says. Sometimes that can complicate things if the teacher takes the child home. But we'll figure it out. The most important thing is making sure he's not left in harm's way." She stood, adjusting her folder. "Would you like to come with me, Noah? I'm going to visit your foster parents right now. Then we'll sort out where you'll be staying tonight." There was a sincere gentleness in her tone that made it clear she was trying to avoid further trauma. But the question made Noah look as though he might faint. His hand darted up to wipe away tears, and he shook his head fiercely. I can't see them. They'll be mad. Please don't make me go with you, he pleaded, each word trembling. Ms. Rowan exchanged a concerned look with the teachers. All right, I won't force you to come inside, she said softly. Maybe you can wait in the car while I speak with them. Does that feel a little better? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, please, he whispered. All right, Ms. Rowan said, turning to Mr. Carver and Ms. Delaney. I'll need to follow procedure here. Let's get him into my car, and I'll drive to his foster home. If there's something in the environment that causes me immediate concern, I'll let the authorities know, and we'll arrange a temporary placement while the situation is investigated. Until I've spoken with them, though, I can't take further action. Mr. Carver and Ms. Delaney both tensed at the notion of Noah going anywhere near that home, but they understood Ms. Rowan's position. Child Protective Services had certain protocols. Ms. Rowan couldn't simply remove him without evidence of abuse or a clear sign of immediate danger. But the bruise, the boy's terror, those were strong signals that something was very, very wrong. When Ms. Rowan stood, so did Noah, albeit shakily. Mr. Carver pulled him into a gentle hug. We're here for you, he whispered. I promise. Ms. Delaney also took Noah's hand for a moment, giving it a light squeeze. Mr. Whitaker managed a comforting smile, though the worry in his eyes was plain. They walked in silence to the main entrance. The overhead lights buzzed quietly, and the faint smell of bleach still lingered from Mr. Whitaker's cleaning spree. Outside, Ms. Rowan's car was parked beneath a street lamp, light reflecting off its hood. She opened the passenger door for Noah, then offered him a seat in the back with a blanket draped over it. It looked like she kept her car prepared for children who might be cold or frightened. He slipped into the back, holding his backpack tightly on his lap. As Ms. Rowan closed the door, she turned to the adults who had gathered on the front steps of the school. I'll call you as soon as I have an update, she said. And I'll do my best to ensure he's safe tonight. If anything goes amiss or if the Gaineses become aggressive, I'll contact the authorities immediately. Mr. Carver nodded, arms folded. Please do, he said. We'll be waiting. She got into her car and pulled out of the lot, with Noah curled in the back seat like a small, fragile bird. Mr. Carver, Ms. Delaney, and Mr. Whitaker stood in the cool evening air for a long moment, none of them speaking. Finally, Ms. Delaney said, I hope she sees what's really going on. That boy is absolutely terrified. Mr. Whitaker pulled his coat tighter around himself. If social services doesn't step in quickly, I'm worried about what might happen, he said. He asked me to let him stay overnight at a school. That's desperation. Mr. Carver breathed out, fighting back an anger that rose within him, an anger directed at a system that sometimes failed vulnerable kids. We can't let him slip through the cracks, he said firmly. Not again. The three parted ways, each carrying the weight of the situation home with them. For Mr. Carver, the night passed in a blur of sleepless worry. He paced around his living room, thinking about how frightened Noah had been, replaying the boy's trembling voice. A single phone call from Ms. Rowan, around 9 o'clock, informed him that she had spoken with the Gaineses, and that Noah was not at immediate physical risk at that exact moment, though she sounded uncertain, as if she had reservations about the entire situation. She planned to follow up the next day. That was the best update she could give. Mr. Carver hung up the phone, unsettled and unable to rest. The following morning, Cedarbrook Academy bustled with its usual energy, students chatting in the hallways, teachers rearranging desks, and the morning announcements echoing through the intercom. Mr. Carver sat behind his desk, anxiously drumming his fingers on the surface, scanning the classroom door for any sign of Noah. Ms. Delaney walked in with a coffee in her hand, concern etched into her features. No sign of him yet, she said quietly. Mr. Carver just shook his head. The morning bell rang. Students shuffled into class, the hum of conversation drifting through the air. But Noah's seat remained conspicuously empty. Mr. Carver tried to focus on his lesson, going through the motions of teaching, but his mind was half elsewhere, consumed by a swirl of worry. After his first class ended, he stepped into the hallway and marched straight to the main office, seeking answers. He found Ms. Delaney there, waiting. "I talked to the secretary," she said. "No phone call from home, no notification about an absence." Her expression said everything. This was not good. A sense of dread settled into Mr. Carver's stomach. He insisted on calling Ms. Rowan. The social worker answered, apologizing for the rushed manner in which she spoke. She hadn't been in the office long. She told him that she had left the Gaineses' residence late the previous night, with a plan to conduct a more thorough home visit soon, but from outward appearances, there was no immediate evidence to remove Noah. She also mentioned that the Gaineses had insisted everything was fine, that Noah was simply acting out, and that the bruise was from a minor accident on a skateboard. According to them, they would ensure he attended school in the morning. "But he's not here," Mr. Carver said curtly, trying not to let his frustration erupt. "I understand," Ms. Rowan replied. "I'll go there later this afternoon. If they can't produce a valid reason for his absence, we'll need to explore further options." That did little to quell Mr. Carver's concern. He hung up and told Ms. Delaney. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, though not so loud that students passing in the hallway could hear. He was so scared. Why would he stay home unless something was really wrong? Ms. Delaney reached out and touched his arm. "We've reported it," she reminded him softly. "We have to trust Ms. Rowan to do her job. Maybe the Gaineses decided not to send him to school because of all the questions. Maybe they're worried about more bruises being noticed." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Mr. Carver retorted, running a hand through his hair. "He's stuck there if they're hiding him." It was a miserable day for them both, overshadowed by concern for Noah. In the late afternoon, Ms. Rowan contacted the school to say that she visited the Gaineses' home. Noah appeared somewhat subdued but physically unharmed. She made note of his fearful demeanor and found the Gaineses' behavior suspiciously polite, as though they were putting on a performance of a perfect household. Still, without solid evidence of abuse, she couldn't yet remove him from the home. However, she mentioned that she felt uneasy enough to continue an investigation. She planned to interview neighbors, ask for medical records if necessary, and keep a close eye on the situation. Mr. Carver felt only mild relief. He knew the wheels of bureaucracy could turn slowly, and in that time, Noah could be subjected to further harm. He went home that evening carrying the same knot of anxiety in his stomach. That night, he barely slept again. The next day, Noah appeared at school. He came in during second period, shoulders hunched, eyes flitting around. Ms. Delaney, who taught that class, noticed him slip in. She had to force herself not to rush over and smother him with concern, not wanting to embarrass him in front of other students. Still, her heart sank when she noticed the fresh bruise under his jaw, partly hidden by the collar of his shirt. She forced a gentle smile, trying to keep the panic out of her gaze. She whispered to him, "Glad to see you back, Noah. How are you feeling?" He looked away, mumbling something unintelligible. She guessed he was bracing himself for more questions. Throughout the lesson, she watched him from the corner of her eye, noticing the constant tension in his posture. At lunch, Ms. Delaney quickly told Mr. Carver what she had seen. He swore under his breath, anger flaring in his eyes. Immediately after lunch, they tried to speak with Noah, but he seemed terrified and clammed up. Nothing they asked would coax him to open up about the bruise or his absence. The day wore on, with Ms. Rowan keeping in touch by phone. She advised them to document any bruises they saw and to encourage Noah to visit the school nurse if he mentioned any pain. Her voice sounded weary, as though she was juggling far too many cases. Mr. Carver felt a deep frustration that the system required so many formal steps before immediate action could be taken, but he did his best to cooperate. He wrote down the day, the time, and the location of the bruise, as Ms. Rowan requested. Evening arrived, and Noah prepared to leave with a group of classmates. Mr. Carver caught sight of him at the front entrance, his small figure dwarfed by older students. Mr. Carver hurried over, calling out softly, "Noah, wait." The boy turned, his eyes wide with anxiety. "Are you sure you're okay?" Mr. Carver asked gently, speaking in a voice so quiet that the milling students wouldn't overhear. "If something happens, you can always come to me, or to Ms. Delaney, or to Mr. Whitaker. We'll find a way to keep you safe." "All right." Noah nodded, but it was a mechanical motion, devoid of real conviction. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice trembled on the word. Then he turned away and disappeared into the crowd of students, heading to the buses. Mr. Carver watched him go, a helpless ache twisting his heart. He spotted Ms. Delaney across the hallway, looking after the boy with the same troubled expression. Days passed in a tense vigil. Noah began wearing long sleeves more frequently, even when the indoor temperature was warm. His eyes had a haunted quality, and he avoided making eye contact with adults. Ms. Delaney tried gentle questioning from time to time, but each attempt only made him shut down further. Mr. Carver noticed he was quieter in class. When asked to read aloud, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitaker would see Noah in the halls, occasionally trying to offer a friendly smile. Sometimes Noah smiled back faintly, but most of the time he seemed lost in his own dark thoughts. The bruise on his jaw faded, only for another on his wrist to appear. Each time, Noah offered excuses. He tripped playing outside, or he bumped into a table. None of it sounded remotely convincing. Meanwhile, Ms. Rowan kept investigating, visiting the Gaines household again, speaking to neighbors and the principal at Cedarbrook. But the Gaineses were adept at maintaining their facade of courteous, concerned adults. They claimed that Noah was a troubled boy who had arrived in their care with emotional baggage and a tendency to harm himself. They acted outraged at the insinuation of abuse, pointing to the warm bed and the neat living space they provided for him. Ms. Rowan, sensing duplicity, pushed further. She confronted them with the new bruises, but the Gaineses insisted that he was reckless, that perhaps he was self-harming in a bid for attention, or that he got hurt on his skateboard, an activity they said they discouraged for safety reasons, but claimed he did anyway. Though Ms. Rowan was not swayed by their words, it was challenging to build an undeniable case quickly. She requested a medical evaluation, but the Gaineses delayed or made excuses for missing appointments. Time inched forward, and every day that Noah walked into school with a new sign of injury only fueled Mr. Carver's and Ms. Delaney's sense of alarm. The tension reached a critical point one afternoon when Mr. Whitaker, finishing his daily cleaning rounds, discovered Noah lingering in a side hallway near the music room. School had ended an hour ago, and nearly everyone had gone home. Noah's backpack was on the floor, and he was sitting against the wall, hugging his knees. When he saw Mr. Whitaker approach, he quickly wiped his eyes as though trying to hide the tears. "Hey, kiddo," Mr. Whitaker said softly. "What are you doing here so late?" Noah's voice wavered. I missed the bus." He lied unconvincingly, his watery eyes betraying the truth. He did not want to go home. Mr. Whitaker's heart sank. He sat down on the floor beside him, ignoring the stiffness in his own knees. "You sure that's all?" he asked quietly. Noah swallowed, pressing his lips together. Suddenly, as though the dam had burst, he buried his face in his arms. His body shook with silent sobs. Mr. Whitaker gently placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the thinness of the boy's frame through his hoodie. He remembered the first time Noah asked to stay overnight, and how that fear had not abated. Without lifting his head, Noah spoke in a cracked whisper, "They're mad at me, so mad at me for talking to Ms. Rowan. I didn't even tell her anything. But they found out anyway and said I was trying to get them in trouble." Mr. Whitaker blinked back tears of his own. He kept his voice calm. "Noah, it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. If they hurt you, that's on them." Noah stayed silent, tears soaking the fabric of his sleeves. Mr. Whitaker wanted nothing more than to wrap the boy in a protective embrace and shield him from all harm. Instead, He reached for his phone and called Mr. Carver, asking him to come down the hallway. Mr. Carver arrived within minutes, his face pale with concern when he saw Noah's distressed state. "I'll take you home," Mr. Carver offered gently, though he inwardly cringed at the idea of returning Noah to that place. But the alternatives were complicated by law. They could not keep him at school overnight without official permission, and Ms. Rowan was already gone for the day, likely in another part of the city tending to another child in crisis. Noah looked up at Mr. Carver with desperation. "Please, can I just stay here?" he begged. Mr. Carver had to fight the urge to nod and say yes, consequences be damned. But he knew he had to follow the rules or risk jeopardizing the investigation. "Listen," he said, voice trembling with compassion. "If I take you home now, I promise I'll call Ms. Rowan right after and tell her that you're afraid. We'll do everything we can so that you don't have to stay there much longer if you're not safe." Noah clutched his knees tighter. "They'll know I talked to you," he said. "They'll be furious." Mr. Whitaker felt rage welling inside. "Let's walk him home together," he suggested to Mr. Carver, not wanting the boy to face the Gaineses alone. Mr. Carver nodded, and they took Noah out to Mr. Carver's car. The drive was tense, silent. Noah stared out the window, shoulders hunched in a posture of dread. The Gaineses lived in a neat, suburban neighborhood, rows of manicured lawns and tidy driveways lined with small shrubs. It looked picturesque, but appearances often lied. As Mr. Carver parked, Noah's breathing quickened. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward from the passenger seat. "We'll walk you to the door," he said gently. "And we'll talk to them, okay?" Noah did not answer, but he unbuckled his seatbelt with shaky fingers. Mr. Carver and Mr. Whitaker escorted him up the path to the front door. Before they could knock, the door opened, revealing Colin Gaines, a man in his late 30s with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, Marissa Gaines stood, her posture rigid. "Hello," Colin said, voice pitched high with an air of contrived politeness. "We were wondering why Noah was running so late. But it looks like you've kindly dropped him off." Mr. Carver cleared his throat, searching for a polite but firm tone. "Yes, Noah missed his bus, and we wanted to make sure he got home safely." Marissa's eyes flicked to Noah, noticing his tear-streaked face. She pressed her lips into a thin line. "Thank you," she said, but her voice carried a hint of coldness. "Noah, come inside." Noah shuffled forward, his face lowered. Mr. Whitaker thought he could sense the tension radiating off the couple. He forced a small smile at them. We just want to make sure everything's okay," he said. "Oh, he's fine," Colin replied too quickly. "He's just been a bit dramatic ever since that social worker started poking her nose into our business. Right, Noah?" Noah's only response was a stiff nod, head tilted down. Mr. Carver clenched his jaw but remained outwardly composed. "We spoke with Ms. Rowan," he said. "She seems to think it's worth keeping an eye on things until the investigation concludes." Marissa laughed, a hollow sound. "It's such a headache, but we understand it's her job. I'm sure once she sees that everything here is perfectly normal, we can move on." Colin opened the door wider, nudging Noah inside. Mr. Carver strained to see if there were any visible signs of disarray or anything that would confirm their suspicions, but the hallway looked neat, the living room beyond it tidy and tastefully decorated. The mask they wore for visitors was firmly in place. "Thanks for bringing him home," Colin said, a subtle finality in his tone. "Have a good evening." Before Mr. Carver or Mr. Whitaker could ask anything else, the door closed, leaving them on the doorstep. Mr. Carver stared at the door, an unsettling feeling roiling in his gut. Mr. Whitaker exhaled, muttering a soft curse under his breath. There had been no overt hostility or refusal, but the tension was thick enough to cut through. "We did what we could," Mr. Whitaker said, though he sounded unconvinced by his own words. Mr. Carver walked back to his car with a dark cloud over his heart. That night, as soon as he got home, he called Ms. Rowan and recounted the evening's events. She promised to file an urgent recommendation for a closer inspection and possibly remove Noah if any new evidence surfaced. "We need something conclusive," she emphasized. "Physical evidence, or a statement from the boy, or from a neighbor who's witnessed something. I'm sorry it's taking so long." The days that followed were a whirlwind of anxiety. Each morning, Mr. Carver arrived at school wondering if he would see Noah's face. Some days the boy arrived with a quiet, haunted look, other days he was absent without explanation. The bruises, unfortunately, kept appearing, some new, some old, each one accompanied by a flimsy excuse. Ms. Rowan arranged a medical exam, but the Gaineses either cancelled or claimed they had no transportation. Meanwhile, Noah grew thinner, more withdrawn. The teachers who cared about him feared the worst but felt powerless, entangled in the slow process of official investigations. Eventually, Ms. Rowan managed a partial breakthrough. After one of her unannounced visits, she convinced her supervisor that the evidence of repeated injuries merited a temporary removal while the situation was assessed. Thus, one afternoon, a car from Child Protective Services arrived at the Gaineses' residence with Ms. Rowan and a police officer. They took Noah away, citing suspicion of physical abuse. When the news reached Mr. Carver at the school, he breathed a sigh of relief. Though he knew the system was not perfect, at least Noah would not have to spend another night in that house. He imagined the boy's sense of fear and confusion, being pulled into a car by officials he barely knew, but he told himself it was a necessary step. Child Protective Services placed Noah in a shelter for at-risk youth, pending an investigation and the next court date. He was assigned a temporary guardian, and Ms. Rowan told Mr. Carver that they would see how he fared there. For a few days, it seemed like a solution, albeit a temporary one. But reality came crashing down when, a week later, Ms. Delaney discovered that Noah was no longer attending class. At first, no one knew why. Then Ms. Rowan informed them that Noah had run away from the shelter the previous evening. One of the staff discovered his bed empty in the middle of the night. Noah was simply gone. Panic flooded Mr. Carver's system. He couldn't imagine a frightened boy of 11 wandering the streets alone, with no money, no real safety net. Ms. Rowan called to ask if Mr. Carver or Ms. Delaney had heard from him, if he might have tried to contact them. They had not. For the next few days, the entire Cedarbrook staff was on edge, scanning the streets on their way to and from work, hoping for any sign of Noah. Ms. Rowan filed a missing persons report, but official efforts were slow. The staff plastered missing flyers around the neighborhood. Fear haunted them all. What if something terrible happened to him while he was out there alone? Then, late one evening, Mr. Carver was leaving a community center after a volunteer tutoring session when he spotted a small figure huddled against the building's side, half hidden behind a trash bin. Something in the posture stopped him in his tracks. Heart pounding, he moved closer. In the dim glow of a street lamp, he recognized that mop of hair, that slender build. It was Noah. "Noah," Mr. Carver breathed, dropping to his knees beside the boy. Noah jerked back in alarm, then recognition flitted across his face. A fleeting relief washed over him, but fear still lingered in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Carver asked urgently, checking the boy for any obvious signs of injury. "We've all been worried sick." Noah's clothes were dirty, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He looked thinner than ever. His lips trembled. "I couldn't stay at that shelter," he said, voice cracked from dehydration or crying, or both. "People come and go, and I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Mr. Carver's chest ached at the desperation in those words. He tried to keep his voice gentle, though the concern practically radiated from him. "Noah, you're going to come with me, all right? You'll stay with me tonight if that's what it takes to keep you safe." Noah looked up, uncertain. "But that's allowed?" Mr. Carver placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll make it allowed," he said, determination burning in his eyes. "I'd rather face the consequences for bending some rules than let you sleep outside and risk your life." Tears welled in Noah's eyes again, and he nodded. Mr. Carver helped him to his feet, steadying him as they walked to his car. During the ride to Mr. Carver's modest apartment, Noah curled up in the passenger seat, no words left in him. Mr. Carver felt a protective surge course through him. He might have been just a teacher, but he would do whatever was necessary to keep Noah out of harm's way. Once home, he guided Noah inside gently, offering a spare bedroom. "It's not fancy," Mr. Carver said, switching on the overhead light. "But it's warm. There's a bed, and I'll get you something to eat." The room was simple, with a small dresser and a window overlooking the street. Noah took in his surroundings with gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Mr. Carver brought him a sandwich and a glass of water. The boy ate quietly, as if any loud sound might shatter the fragile haven he had just found. When Mr. Carver stepped out into the hallway, he leaned against the wall, pressing a hand over his face, tears prickling in his eyes. He felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened, the system's snail-like pace, the constant fear Noah lived in, and now the reality of having an 11-year-old boy in dire need of care under his roof. He was determined not to let the boy slip through his fingers again. Early the next morning, Mr. Carver called Ms. Rowan, explaining the situation. She listened in solemn understanding. "I'm glad he found you," she said. "And if you're truly willing to be his foster placement, we might make that happen. Given the circumstances, you have a close bond with him, and it might be beneficial for him to be with someone he trusts. Let me run this by my supervisor and the court liaison." Mr. Carver felt relief at her words. He thanked her, then called the school, letting them know he would be late. He prepared a modest breakfast for Noah, scrambled eggs and toast. When Noah emerged, he looked timid and skittish, but a bit more alert after a night of rest. "Good morning," Mr. Carver said softly, placing a plate in front of him. "How are you feeling?" Noah managed a small smile. "Better," he replied, voice hoarse. He sipped the water, then quietly thanked Mr. Carver for letting him stay. As the morning wore on, Ms. Rowan made good on her word. A flurry of phone calls ensued, verifying that Mr. Carver could indeed take temporary custody of Noah as a foster parent if certain emergency measures were approved by the court. By midday, Ms. Rowan arrived with paperwork, and Mr. Carver signed everything necessary, determined to give Noah a stable place. Noah looked on with wide eyes, as though scarcely believing that someone actually wanted to provide him with a safe home. Thus, the next chapter of Noah's life began. He moved into Mr. Carver's apartment officially, bringing a few meager possessions from the Gaineses' house, whatever Ms. Rowan retrieved on his behalf. Noah seldom spoke of the specifics of the abuse, but the bruises on his body were unmistakable. A doctor's exam confirmed that some of them were consistent with forceful handling. A legal proceeding began, focusing on the Gaineses' foster license and potential child abuse charges. Ms. Rowan told Mr. Carver that the case against them was strong, but that everything hinged on consistent evidence and, if possible, Noah's testimony. The boy, however, was paralyzed by fear. Whenever Ms. Rowan brought up the possibility of testifying about what happened in that house, he withdrew. Sometimes he would begin shaking, and tears would trace down his cheeks silently. Mr. Carver tried to comfort him, explaining that his voice was important, that it could help ensure the Gaineses could never hurt him again. But Noah would stare off into space, whispering, "I can't talk about it. I can't." It took time, and many gentle conversations in the quiet, safe walls of Mr. Carver's apartment, before Noah started to open up about the details. Late one night, as thunder rolled outside the windows, he spoke in hushed tones about how Colin would grab him by the arm and yank him across the room when he was displeased, about how Marissa would slap him on the face if he was disobedient, about how they had threatened that he would be taken away to a far worse place if he ever told anyone. Mr. Carver listened, heartbreak etched in every line of his face. He resisted the urge to question or interrupt, just letting the boy pour out whatever he could manage. "They told me no one else would ever want me," Noah whispered, voice trembling. "They said all foster homes are like this, and if I tried to run, I'd end up somewhere even worse." Mr. Carver felt tears burning in his eyes, but he forced a reassuring tone. "They lied," he said quietly. "They were just trying to control you." Noah sniffed, nodding as though he wanted to believe it. Over the next few days, small changes took place in the boy's demeanor. He no longer woke up screaming from nightmares every single night. Sometimes he only whimpered in his sleep. He started trusting Mr. Carver enough to accept hugs or a comforting hand on his shoulder. He even began joking shyly about how messy Mr. Carver's fridge was, or how many different ties he owned for teaching. Their bond grew in these moments of normalcy. But the real test loomed in the form of a court hearing, where the question of whether the Gaineses would retain their foster license or possibly face criminal charges would be weighed. Noah was the key witness. If he testified and told the judge what had happened behind closed doors, it would be a near-certain victory for Ms. Rowan's side. But if he remained silent, the Gaineses' lawyer would point to the lack of direct testimony, claiming there was no conclusive evidence that the bruises were inflicted intentionally. For weeks, Ms. Rowan tried gently coaxing Noah to speak up, even bringing in a child psychologist to help him process his trauma. Mr. Carver also tried, with caution, never wanting to push him too hard. Noah remained tormented by the idea of seeing the Gaineses in court. He remembered their threats, the memory of their harsh voices echoing in his head. He dreaded the idea of them staring at him from the defendant's table, potentially smirking or glaring in a way that only he would notice. The day of the hearing arrived in a gray, cold drizzle. Mr. Carver drove Noah to the courthouse, Ms. Rowan following in her own car. Noah sat in the passenger seat, fiddling nervously with the seatbelt, while Mr. Carver tried to reassure him that he would stand by him no matter what. The courthouse corridors smelled of stale coffee and cleaning fluid, the lighting fluorescent and harsh. Noah's eyes darted around as if expecting the Gaineses to leap out from every corner. The boy wore a new outfit purchased by Mr. Carver, a simple button-down shirt and clean trousers, making him look more like a typical student, though the dark circles under his eyes testified to his sleepless night. They waited on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, the minutes dragging by, tension coiling in Noah's stomach. When they were finally called in, Ms. Rowan gave Noah a brief, supportive squeeze on the shoulder, then led him into the courtroom. Mr. Carver sat with the boy in a small section designated for those involved in the case. The Gaineses were already seated across the aisle, wearing carefully chosen outfits that presented them as mild-mannered, concerned foster parents. Colin glanced briefly at Noah, a flicker of anger in his eyes that only the boy noticed. Marissa kept her face impassive. The judge, a stern-faced woman, began the proceedings. The lawyers made their opening statements, with Ms. Rowan providing testimony about her concerns regarding repeated physical injuries, the suspicious excuses, and Noah's flight from the shelter. The Gaineses' defense attorney painted a picture of a troubled child who was prone to self-harm and had run away multiple times from different foster placements. He insisted that the Gaineses were only trying to help a difficult boy who refused to accept their discipline. When it came time for witnesses, Ms. Delaney and Mr. Whitaker took the stand, each testifying about bruises they had seen and the boy's frequent terror. They recounted how he once begged to stay overnight at the school. Their testimonies were sincere and troubling, but the defense attorney tried to paint them as well-meaning staff who had misinterpreted normal childhood accidents. Finally, the moment came for Noah's testimony. A hush fell over the courtroom. Noah was called forward. He stood, knees trembling so badly that Mr. Carver feared he might collapse. He made his way to the witness stand, glancing back once to lock eyes with Mr. Carver, who nodded encouragingly. Ms. Rowan had tried to arrange that Noah could provide testimony by video or in a private setting, but the judge had deemed it unnecessary. So he had to face his alleged abusers directly. The prosecutor, a calm, patient woman, guided him with gentle, supportive questions. Noah, do you remember the times the Gaineses would discipline you physically? Noah's gaze flickered to Colin and Marissa. His voice failed him. He was trembling, and tears pricked his eyes. For a moment it seemed he might remain paralyzed, just as he had in the weeks before, locked in terror. The prosecutor repeated the question quietly. Noah, can you tell the court if Colin and Marissa Gaines ever hurt you physically? No sound emerged from his throat. A flush of color crept up his cheeks, and his hands shook on the arm of the witness stand. He remembered the threats, how they had told him that if he ever spoke against them, they would find him no matter where he was. He imagined them sneaking into Mr. Carver's home, waiting for him in the shadows. He remembered nights of hearing footsteps outside his bedroom door, tensing for the next blow. Then he remembered something else. The warmth of Mr. Carver's small apartment, the way Ms. Delaney had always been so kind, the gentle patience of Ms. Rowan, and how Mr. Whitaker used to say, "We're here for you, Noah." He forced his gaze away from the Gaineses, and he focused on Mr. Carver. Their eyes met, and Mr. Carver mouthed silently, "It's okay." Tears blurred Noah's vision, but he took a breath. Then, in a voice that shook, he finally spoke, "They hurt me." He stared at the floor, but he kept going, words tumbling out in a rushed hush. "They would grab me, and if I tried to run, they'd push me down. They slapped me. They told me I deserved it, and that nobody else would want me if I left." His statement might have been short, but in the silence that followed, it echoed powerfully throughout the courtroom. The prosecutor asked a few more gentle questions, verifying details, each answer further implicating the Gaineses. Colin and Marissa exchanged glances, their lawyers stiffening as the tide of the case shifted with every tremulous word from Noah's mouth. For the first time, the fear in Noah's voice was overshadowed by a flicker of defiance, of courage. He was naming his abusers, publicly. Even if his voice quavered, he was still speaking. When it was over, the defense tried to cross-examine him, but the judge kept the questions from becoming too hostile, gently reminding the defense attorney of the child's fragile state. Noah's words remained consistent. They had hurt him. No, he wasn't lying to get attention. No, he hadn't caused the bruises himself. Yes, he was terrified of them. By the time Noah stepped down from the witness stand, tears slipped down his cheeks. Mr. Carver reached out and squeezed his hand as he passed, whispering, "I'm proud of you." Noah stumbled back to his seat, burying his face in his hands, overwhelmed by emotion. The rest of the hearing felt almost anticlimactic. The Gaineses, rattled, tried to maintain their composure, but the prosecutor was relentless, using Noah's testimony alongside the physical evidence and the statements from the school staff to make a strong case. The judge ordered that the Gaineses' foster license be revoked and scheduled a separate criminal trial to determine charges of child abuse. She made it clear that Noah would not be returning to their home under any circumstances. Mr. Carver breathed a sigh of relief, offering Ms. Rowan a small, exhausted smile. Noah looked numb, as though he couldn't fully process that he had finally told the truth in front of everyone, effectively ensuring the Gaineses would never be able to harm him again. Ms. Rowan gently placed a hand on his shoulder, leading him out of the courtroom. They stepped into the hallway, where Mr. Carver knelt beside him and said quietly, "You did good, kid. So brave." Noah gulped for air, letting out a shaky breath. His eyes darted around, still expecting the Gaineses to be lurking, but they were left behind in the courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and court officials. Yet, despite this apparent victory, an ominous feeling lingered. Perhaps it was the look Colin Gaines had given Noah before he was led away by his lawyer, a look that promised retribution. Or maybe it was the memory of all those nights Noah had endured. Even though the system had finally stepped in, Mr. Carver felt a prickle of fear in the back of his mind, an intuition that the Gaineses wouldn't go quietly into the night. Time pressed forward. The criminal trial was set for several weeks later, giving the Gaineses time to prepare a defense. They were out on bail but monitored. Noah remained in Mr. Carver's care, growing more comfortable day by day, albeit still plagued by nightmares. The school environment was kinder now that his classmates and teachers recognized he was part of Mr. Carver's household. No one teased him. Instead, people quietly cheered him on or offered shy encouragement. Ms. Delaney noticed a new sense of relief in his posture, though shadows of past trauma still clung to him. For a time, it seemed like the worst might be over. With the social worker's help, Mr. Carver was on track to become Noah's permanent foster guardian, and the adoption process was hinted at as a possibility down the line, if all went well. Noah began to smile now and then, a small but genuine smile that transformed his face and hinted at the boy he might have been if life had been gentler. He still had therapy sessions to help him cope with his trauma, often returning home looking drained but a little less burdened each time. But everything changed 2.5 weeks after the hearing. It was an ordinary, quiet night. Mr. Carver and Noah had shared a simple dinner of pasta, then watched a nature documentary on TV, both of them feeling calm, almost content. Shortly after 10, Mr. Carver told Noah to get ready for bed. The boy nodded, and Mr. Carver went to wash the dishes, humming softly. The events of the past few weeks had begun to feel like a nightmare that was receding into memory. He was in the middle of rinsing a pan when a sudden crash shattered the stillness of the apartment. It came from the living room. Before Mr. Carver could react, he heard Noah scream. His blood turned to ice, and the pan clattered into the sink. He sprinted out of the kitchen, heart pounding. The sight that greeted him caused his lungs to seize in horror. The front door had been forced open, its lock splintered. There stood Colin Gaines, eyes wild, panting with rage. Behind him, Marissa hovered in the shadows, face twisted with an unsettling determination. Noah was pinned to the floor by Colin's strong grip, and the boy's face was contorted in panic. Mr. Carver froze for a split second, then lunged forward, shouting, "Get away from him!" Colin snarled, shoving Mr. Carver back with surprising force. Mr. Carver stumbled against the couch, nearly losing his balance. Marissa grabbed Noah's arm, yanking him upward. He shrieked in pain, tears streaming down his cheeks. The entire scene was chaos. Furniture knocked over, a lamp crashed to the floor with a dull thud. Mr. Carver tried to regain his footing, but Colin swung a fist, catching him across the jaw. Pain exploded in Mr. Carver's head, and he fell backward again. "You ruined our lives," Colin spat, voice quivering with fury. "You think you can turn him against us? He's ours to foster, not yours. You meddling teacher." Marissa, clutching Noah's arm, hissed, "We aren't going to let them keep you, do you hear me, Noah?" Noah cried out, "Let me go." His voice was high, panicked. He twisted, but Marissa's grip tightened. Mr. Carver, blinking away stars, scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging. He lunged at Marissa, trying to pry her off Noah. But Colin caught him again, grappling with him. Mr. Carver managed a wild punch to Colin's shoulder, but Colin fought with the frantic strength of someone with nothing left to lose. He pinned Mr. Carver's arm behind his back. The teacher let out a strangled cry, his body contorted in pain. Noah struggled, tears blurring his vision. He screamed, "Leave him alone!" Then, in a moment of desperation, he kicked backward against Marissa's shin. Marissa yelped, loosening her grip briefly. Noah twisted away, trying to escape. But Colin, seeing this, released Mr. Carver abruptly and lunged at Noah. Mr. Carver collapsed to the floor, arm twisted and throbbing, but he mustered every ounce of will to crawl forward, reaching for the boy. It was too late. Colin yanked Noah upright, hooking an arm around his neck. Noah let out a choked sob. Marissa, her face contorted in hate, threw open the front door fully. Together, they dragged him outside into the night. Mr. Carver stumbled after them, dizzy from pain and shock, shouting, "No! Stop!" He reached the door in time to see them forcing Noah into a vehicle parked haphazardly at the curb. Noah's terrified eyes locked with Mr. Carver's for a split second, and then the car roared away, tires squealing on the asphalt. Mr. Carver staggered, nearly tripping on the front steps. He tore down the street after them for a few steps, shouting, "Noah!" But the car's taillights vanished around a corner, leaving him in darkness and bitter silence. The next few moments were a blur. Mr. Carver, shaking violently, fumbled for his phone to call the police. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear the operator's voice. He managed to choke out his address, describing the break-in and that Noah had been abducted by the Gaineses. As soon as he ended the call, he dialed Ms. Rowan, his voice trembling uncontrollably as he left a panicked message on her voicemail. The night seemed eerily still after the tumult. The door to his apartment splintered, a testament to the violent intrusion. Blood trickled from Mr. Carver's lip where Colin's punch had landed. He could barely think straight, consumed by fear for Noah. Police arrived in minutes, flooding the scene with flashing lights. An ambulance arrived to check Mr. Carver's injuries, though he insisted he was fine except for a possibly dislocated arm or sprain. What truly mattered, he told the officers, was that they find Noah. He recounted everything he knew, describing the Gaineses' vehicle and the direction they had driven off. Ms. Rowan soon called back, voice tense with alarm. She promised to notify the agency's legal department and to coordinate with law enforcement. The kidnapping of a child, especially in direct violation of a court order, was now a federal matter. The hours that followed were some of the worst of Mr. Carver's life. He paced in his apartment, replaying the scene of terror. He kept imagining Noah's screams, the look of betrayal and fear in his eyes. The realization that the boy who had finally begun to trust him was now in the clutches of the very abusers he'd escaped from made him sick with guilt and rage. The police set up a search, distributing bulletins with photos of Colin and Marissa Gaines, listing them as suspected kidnappers. Ms. Rowan and Child Protective Services scrambled to provide any details that might help locate them. Neighbors were interviewed, but no one had seen anything beyond the speeding car. Cedarbrook Academy's staff, upon hearing the news, were horrified and offered any possible help, from searching the area to contacting local media. Days passed, every one of them a torturous eternity for Mr. Carver and for Ms. Delaney, Mr. Whitaker, Ms. Rowan, and all who cared about Noah. The police traced possible leads, but the Gaineses seemed to have vanished. Some hinted that they might have left the state, perhaps heading to a remote area where law enforcement had less reach. The situation escalated to involve national agencies. Mr. Carver found it near impossible to focus on anything else. He barely taught his classes, leaning on Ms. Delaney and substitute teachers to cover for him as he spoke to investigators. At night, he lay awake, imagining the worst. Was Noah being hurt again? Would they keep him alive if they believed there was no future for them? On the fourth day since the kidnapping, Mr. Carver received a phone call that both terrified and relieved him. Authorities in another state had tracked the Gaineses' vehicle to a motel near the highway. They executed a swift operation to rescue Noah and apprehend Colin and Marissa. Details were scarce at first, but an investigator confirmed that Noah had been found, shaken and scared but alive. Mr. Carver nearly collapsed in tears of relief upon hearing the news. The next hours were a frenzy of phone calls and arrangements to bring Noah home safely. It was an FBI agent who later explained the final rescue in more detail. The Gaineses had holed up in a motel, apparently trying to figure out their next move. Noah was trapped in the room with them. When law enforcement teams arrived, Colin became agitated and threatened to harm Noah if they didn't back away. According to the agent, they had to act quickly to subdue Colin physically, waiting until he momentarily let his guard down before they surged forward and incapacitated him. Marissa was also restrained. Noah was rushed away, trembling and clinging to the rescuers, tears streaming down his face. Once local medical professionals cleared Noah, arrangements were made to fly him back home. Mr. Carver stood anxiously at the airport waiting area, eyes scanning each exit for the boy's face. When he finally saw Noah stepping off the plane with Ms. Rowan, tears welled in Mr. Carver's eyes, and he rushed forward, ignoring the protest of his still aching arm. Noah paused, a look of raw vulnerability crossing his face. Then he ran into Mr. Carver's open arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Mr. Carver clutched him, tears pouring down his own cheeks, heedless of the many eyes around them. "It's okay," Mr. Carver whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. You're safe." Noah cried too hard to speak, clutching Mr. Carver's shirt in his fist. They remained locked in that embrace for a long time, Ms. Rowan watching with tears shining in her own eyes. Nearby passers-by gave them a respectful distance. When Noah finally managed to whisper, "I was so scared," Mr. Carver pressed his cheek to the top of the boy's head and murmured, "I know. I'm so sorry. But I've got you now." With the Gaineses in custody, indicted on multiple charges including kidnapping and child endangerment, Noah's nightmares gradually eased. The first few nights after his return, he barely slept, jolting awake at every sound. Mr. Carver let him keep a small lamp on and stayed by his side as often as needed, reading aloud from storybooks or just talking softly until the boy drifted off again. Therapy intensified, sessions specifically targeting trauma from both the abuse and the terrifying abduction. Ms. Delaney visited often, bringing homemade cookies and gentle companionship. Mr. Whitaker stopped by, too, occasionally fixing minor repairs or bringing groceries, always finding small ways to offer comfort. Over time, Noah began to heal. The bruises from the kidnapping faded, though the emotional scars would take longer. He returned to Cedarbrook Academy amid a wave of relief from teachers and classmates who had feared the worst. At first, he flinched at sudden movements or loud voices. But with each day, he felt a little safer, bolstered by the knowledge that the Gaineses were behind bars and would face trial and, in all likelihood, a prison sentence. Finally, on a day filled with gentle spring sunshine and birdsong, Mr. Carver decided it was time to ask Noah a question he had been pondering for some time. Sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment after a quiet dinner, he reached across and touched Noah's hand. "Noah," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'd like to adopt you, if that's something you want too. I know you've been through so much, and I don't want you to feel any pressure. But if you're ready, I'd be honored to be your father." Noah's eyes shone with emotion. It took him a moment to respond, his throat working as he fought back tears. He remembered the countless nights Mr. Carver had stayed with him when nightmares clawed at his sleep, the gentle reassurance in his voice when the world felt unsafe, and the unwavering support through the entire ordeal of the trial and kidnapping. The corners of his mouth trembled as he nodded, tears slipping onto his cheeks. "Yes," he whispered. I want that." Mr. Carver pulled him into a warm hug, tears of joy and relief streaming down his own cheeks. The adoption process was not immediate. There were forms, court dates, home evaluations, but after everything they had endured, it felt like a beacon of hope. Each day that passed, they grew closer, forging a bond deeper than teacher and student, deeper even than foster parent and child. They became a family in every sense but on paper, and soon that final, official step would be taken. Several weeks later, after more legal procedures, the day arrived. Dressed in neatly pressed clothes, Mr. Carver and Noah stood in front of a family court judge, who smiled warmly as she signed the final adoption decree. Ms. Delaney, Ms. Rowan, and Mr. Whitaker all attended, offering quiet cheers and applause. Noah gripped Mr. Carver's hand through the entire proceeding, his heart hammering with excitement and gratitude. Afterward, they all went to a small diner to celebrate. Noah sipped a milkshake while Ms. Delaney and Mr. Carver reminisced about the first day they had noticed something was amiss, how Mr. Whitaker had found him in the hallway that late night, and how Ms. Rowan had worked tirelessly to ensure his safety. There were tears, there was laughter, and there was a profound sense of closure for the darkness that had once loomed over them. Yet, Noah understood that healing was not an event but a journey. Sometimes the old fears still rose up unexpectedly, triggered by a sharp voice or a slamming door. Therapy continued, and Mr. Carver patiently supported him every step of the way. The nightmares became less frequent, and Noah found comfort in the knowledge that the people who had hurt him were locked away for a long time, their efforts to torment him permanently foiled by the justice system. With each new day, he learned to trust in the love and stability Mr. Carver provided. 1 month after the kidnapping, Noah and Mr. Carver shared a quiet dinner of homemade pizza in their apartment. The battered front door had been replaced, symbolizing a fresh start. The TV was turned off, and the only sound in the small dining area was their soft conversation and the tinkling of cutlery against plates. Noah looked across at the man who had saved him, who had become his parent, and felt an unfamiliar but welcome warmth in his chest. The feeling of being home. He said, "Thank you for everything," his voice barely above a whisper. I feel safe with you." Mr. Carver reached across the table and grasped the boy's hand. "I'm always going to keep you safe," he promised, his voice steady with conviction. And Noah believed him. In that moment the future felt open, wide, and bright. The shadows of the past had not vanished completely, memories of fear and pain still lurked in quiet corners. But together they had chosen hope over despair, love over cruelty, and truth over silence. For the first time, Noah could imagine a life defined not by old bruises or sleepless nights, but by laughter, learning, and the promise of belonging. And as father and son cleared the dishes away, ready to settle in for the evening, they both understood that while the journey had been fraught with danger and heartache, it had led them to a bond that neither time nor distance could break. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.